Okay.
Okay, hi. Hello, everybody. My name's Kevin Harris. I'm a professor of sociology at UCLA. I'm here to moderate the first panel for a series of panels this winter quarter at the Center for Social Theory and Comparative History at UCLA, which I co-run with Professor Robert Brenner is here and Professor Tsinghua Lee, who's in the silent audience. And I'm really excited today. This is the first of 4 panels that we have scheduled for winter quarter with a broad theme of the political economy of rising authoritarianism across the world. This particular panel focuses on the Middle East. We're going to have panels over the next 2 months on China with Barry Naughton and Victor Shi, on India with Jyoti Ghosh and Pranab Bardhan, on Southeast Asia with Dan Slater, and Latin America with Alfredo Sadfilo. So very eminent scholars on a key topic. And speaking of eminent scholars, we have eminent scholars right here. So the structure of the panel is kind of more as a kind of a roundtable discussion. We're going to feature our speakers and then a discussant. If you are watching and you have any questions, this is a Zoom talk, but this is also being recorded and will be put online for the broader public shortly thereafter. So if you have any questions for any of the speakers, you can send them via the chat function to myself or to our center student administrator, Rohan Advani. So please send a direct question as opposed to chat to all. And I'm going to introduce our speakers and then we're going to get started. So today we have some of the probably most exciting writers and thinkers on the left when it comes to political economy of the Middle East. I've taught their work and I'm very excited they've all agreed to be here. In fact, as one of our speakers is in Cairo, that's kind of why we're a bit early for Los Angeles time. But the sun is up, so that counts. Still, it's the day. So I'll just introduce the speakers in order, and then we'll get started. First up, we're going to hear from Professor Adam Hanieh. Adam's professor of political economy and global development at the University of Exeter, and he's the joint chair at the Institute of International Area Studies at Tsinghua University in China. He is the author of several books, most recently Money Markets and Monarchies, the Gulf Cooperation Council, and the Political Economy of the Contemporary Middle East, which is a widely read and well-regarded book. Next, we're going to hear from Amr Adly. I met Amr in Cairo, as we were just discussing, over 10 years ago. And Amr is now assistant professor in the Department of Political Science at the American University in Cairo. And he's the author of an excellent recent book, Cleft Capitalism, The Social Origins of Failed Market Making in Egypt, came out in 2020. And then finally, we're going to hear from Shana Marshall. Shana is Associate Director of the Institute for Middle East Studies and Assistant Research Professor at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And her scholarship examines how Middle East states use arms sales to channel financial resources and economic privileges to state elites. So everybody gets about 25 minutes. Adam, then Amr, then Sean is going to be acting as a discussant. And as they are talking, please send any questions to Rohan Advani or myself. So take it away, Adam.
Okay, thank you very much, Kevin, and thanks for inviting me as part of this center presentation on authoritarianism. I wanted to basically cover 3 points today. I wanted firstly to speak about the issue of authoritarianism in the Middle East region, looking at its roots and its implications, particularly in the wake of the 2011 uprisings. Then I wanted to turn to the particular role of the Gulf Cooperation Council or the Gulf states in the region itself and explore what this might have to do with how we think about authoritarianism. And then finally, I wanted to spend a few minutes talking about the current moment particularly the impact of the pandemic, because I think this has a lot of important implications for the direction that the region is taking and the kind of retrenchment of authoritarian states in the Middle East today. So to begin with, around the more general points of authoritarianism, looking back at the 2011 uprisings, it was very obvious, I think, at that moment for all of us who are involved with the region, that much of the mainstream media and political commentary about those uprisings and trying to explain the roots of those uprisings focused around this kind of conventional idea of political democracy, democratic freedom, and free markets or economic freedom. The problem, according to this conventional approach, was that the stifling effects of authoritarian governments in the region over capitalist markets prevented the emergence of a vibrant private sector and held back the region's economic potential. And the uprisings that occurred in that moment in 2011 and the years that followed could therefore be understood as both a protest against dictatorship or a desire for free political systems, as well as a desire for free market economies. So I think it's worthwhile to go back and look at some of the statements we heard at that moment. For example, Obama, US president at that moment, talking very clearly that, to quote, America's support for democracy will be based on ensuring financial stability, promoting reform, and integrating competitive markets with each other and the global economy. Likewise, the statements made at that moment by Robert Zoellick, the then president of the World Bank, I think are very illustrative, where he cast the roots of the Tunisian uprising in the fact that there was too much red tape for those who wanted to get involved in capitalist markets. And this was essentially a protest against that red tape. And later in the months that followed, we saw this linkage between free markets and political democracy really kind of become epitomized in the discourse of international financial institutions, whose role was recast as benign and benevolent actors, ready to support some kind of transition to democracy, and of course being willing to provide the technocratic expertise to construct open economic markets. So again, I think there's a need to kind of go back and study quite closely this kind of discourse of that time. In contrast to this kind of conventional framework, I think it is very clear that the way that capitalist development has occurred in the Middle East and indeed elsewhere is through and very much in relationship to authoritarian states. This was very clear, I think, in the 1980s, at this important moment when structural adjustment programs began to be rolled out through the region, and in particular Egypt, and as I'm sure Amr will speak to, as the kind of model case for the region, with individuals such as Mubarak as well as Ben Ali coming to power in the early 1980s, really leading on these neoliberal reforms, and at the same time driving this forward with authoritarian rule. In this sense, there was no essential contradiction between the kinds of economic policies that we associate with the structural adjustment packages and political authoritarianism. The opening up of markets and the steady creep of neoliberal reform throughout the region depended precisely upon authoritarian states. Of course, this was fully supported by Western governments at that time, and who lauded the direction of economic policy making, as well as the authoritarian character of states in Egypt and elsewhere. Now, I want to be clear here. I'm not saying that authoritarianism was born in the 1980s with the neoliberal moment. It clearly predated that period. It's clear that the Arab nationalist governments that came to power in the post-war era in the Middle East had very extreme authoritarian characteristics that were later adapted by this new generation of leaders in the 1980s. Nasser, for example, the kind of corporatist control over union and social movements at that moment was adopted by or remolded or repackaged by individuals such as Mubarak. But the key point is that there was no contradiction between authoritarian states and economic liberalization in the region. And indeed, authoritarianism, I think, was necessary, partly to roll back and repress the social movements that emerged in relation to these structural adjustment packages. So I know perhaps this is something we can perhaps go into more detail in the discussion, but there's a term that's become, I think, more and more prevalent in the literature, this idea of authoritarian neoliberalism, to describe not just states in the global south, but also the United States, UK, European states, where we see this kind of deepening of the authoritarian characteristics of capitalist states alongside this turn to or deepening of market-led development. I am a bit equivocal about this term in the sense that I think there is utility in the point in that it points to the way that neoliberal reform is often twinned with authoritarian characteristics. But I am at the same time a little bit I think we need to be careful that we don't kind of set up this kind of contradiction or to say there's a kind of neoliberalism that is not authoritarianism. I think the fact, if we look at this moment, certainly since the Chilean experience at the birth of neoliberalism, we can see that authoritarianism was very much embedded within the state form, and it continues to be perhaps more prevalent today than even those moments. Now, in the Middle East, this was also closely connected to war and occupation, foreign intervention in the region, as the examples of Iraq and Palestine illustrate very clearly. But I want to highlight just a couple of, or two consequences of this moment, of this twinning of neoliberal reform with the authoritarian state. Firstly, what this did through the 1990s and early 2000s, leading up to the 2011 uprisings, was the development of very large and persistent disparities in the ownership and control of wealth, access to resources and markets, and the exercise of political power. It's very clear that, and I think there's some recent studies that point to the fact that the Middle East is actually the most unequal region in the world today. We can see this through statistics around labor markets and unemployment, labor force participation. We can see this in particular around women and youth employment, the spread of the informal sector and informality, labor informality, levels of poverty, health and educational outcomes, that if compared to other regions, the Middle East actually ranks at the bottom of the world in terms of inequality and in fact, one recent study suggests that the top 1%, the income share of the top 1% in the Middle East stands at about 30% of total income in the region, compared to something like 12% in Western Europe, 20% in the US, even more than Brazil or South Africa. So There's another statistic that I recently came across, that just 31 billionaires in the Middle East control the wealth of half the wealth or as much wealth as the bottom half of the adult population in the region. So we can see these kinds of extreme inequalities, extreme disparities opened up through the last several decades, which was a key aspect to the 2011 uprisings themselves, and really I think points to the way that both the political and the economic dimensions were at the core of those uprisings. Secondly, though, the other consequence of this kind of several decade process has been a long-term erosion in political legitimacy of ruling classes throughout the region itself. And I think this is something that's become particularly acute since 2011. In other words, established political leaderships in many countries across the region have repeatedly shown themselves incapable of addressing the different dimensions of capitalist crisis or the severe deterioration in living conditions that have marked the neoliberal period. This kind of lack of durable political hegemony is marked or is manifest, I think, in the repeated cycles of popular protest and social mobilization. 2011 is a clear example of this, but I think we can see it again in 2018 with the new kind of mobilizations, or the second kind of wave of mobilizations that took place in places like Lebanon, Iraq, Algeria. Sudan is an extremely important example of this. Iraq also at that moment. So we have these kind of highly volatile, unstable government coalitions, repeated cycles of mobilization that take up both the political and the economic as an indication of this kind of lack of, or the weakness of political legitimacy in the region. I think this is really important. I'll come back to this in relation to the pandemic in my final comments. Okay, I just want to move now, though, to the second aspect, which I think is really important to looking at kind of the character of authoritarianism in the Middle East, and that is the particular role of the Gulf Arab states, the Gulf Cooperation Council states, most notably led by Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates, but Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Oman, also important aspects, these 6 states making up the Gulf Cooperation Council. One thing I think that is not as well appreciated about the experience of the neoliberal period in the Middle East is the way that this opening up of markets throughout the region in the 90s and particularly the early 2000s led to these Gulf states in the regional political economy. What I mean here is that as markets opened up in places like Egypt, Jordan, Tunisia, Lebanon, and elsewhere, Gulf capitalist conglomerates, large business conglomerates headquartered in the Gulf states, closely linked to the ruling families and the state structures in the Gulf, were main beneficiaries of this liberalization. The internationalization of Gulf capital throughout the region, buying up financial institutions, investing in banks, industrial corporations, real estate, retail, agribusiness, all of these sectors. If we examine closely these sectors, we can see the growing weight of Gulf capital in these regional class hierarchies. I think this is really important because it links the dynamics of capitalist accumulation in the Gulf with the way that capitalist markets function elsewhere in the Middle East itself. And I think there's a convincing case to be made that the tempo of accumulation in the Gulf is linked to the way that markets operate elsewhere, and the ownership of capital in the region outside of the Gulf itself is increasingly connected or connected with Gulf capitalists. So what this means, I think, is when we're thinking about class formation in a country like Egypt, we need to think around the ways that Gulf capitalism is interpenetrated or connected with Egyptian capital or Tunisian capital, or Lebanese capital, or Jordanian, Palestinian capital, all the way through. Now, this is important for our discussion today in relation to authoritarianism, because it has meant that the Gulf states have a particular interest in the state structures in the rest of the region, and have become, through the 2000s, and particularly after 2011, very tightly connected or embedded in the state form elsewhere in the Middle East. Now, I'm speaking about the Gulf collectively here, but it's important again to signal I'm not speaking here. I'm not saying that there aren't differences between the different Gulf states. There clearly are rivalries, particularly between Qatar on one hand and Saudi Arabia and the UAE on the other. There are rivalries between Saudi and the UAE and the other states. But we see since 2011 this kind of jockeying for position, for power in the region that I think has very clear political economic underpinnings connected to this process of the internationalization of Gulf capital, as well as their interest in seeing authoritarian states kind of steer the region in the direction that's amenable to the interests of the Gulf itself. Now, there's a whole layer of other questions that arise that, again, this we can perhaps discuss with in the discussion around the Gulf's increasing connections with Israel as part of this process, the normalization between the UAE and Israel, obviously being a key part of this. This is connected very much to US strategy in the Middle East, and particularly the attempt by successive US governments since at least the Bush administration to kind of knit together the different pillars of power in the region, in particularly the Gulf and Israel. Through kind of free trade agreements and economic agreements. It also, obviously, this whole kind of process I've been describing about the Gulf's position in the region is very much connected to rivalries with other powers, regional powers such as Iran and Turkey, and of course the involvement of Russia and China in the region. But I do think it's an underappreciated point that when we talk about this kind of neoliberal or the experience of neoliberalism in the Middle East, we need to look beyond just the national scale and kind of understand the regional reconfiguration of capitalism that occurred at this moment as well. Okay, just to finally turn to the pandemic, because I really think that there's a lot that is changing as following the pandemic, obviously connected more widely with some of the things I've spoken about, and in particular this kind of second wave of uprisings that began in 2018 and through 2019. I think what the pandemic is really highlighting is that this is not simply a public health emergency or public health crisis. The way that the pandemic is unfolding across the region is serving to kind of accentuate the regional differences, accentuate the kind of variegated nature of capitalism in the Middle East. So the differences in wealth and class power that have marked the region over the last few decades and continuing after 2011 have, I think, deepened over the last 2 years with the pandemic itself. I think we can quite clearly see that Israel and the GCC are emerging from the pandemic in a strengthened position regionally relative to to other states that have been hit quite severely, both by the pandemic, but also by the crises that emerged from 2011, the refugee crisis, the displacement in places like Syria and Lebanon and Libya and elsewhere. So, as with elsewhere around the world, it's the poorest and most marginalized groups that have been hit by the pandemic, but it's also, I think, serving to accentuate these regional differences. However, I would say, and this is kind of where I want to end things, I would say that we need to remember that kind of point about the kind of political legitimacy or the political dimensions of the current moment. The fact that the pandemic hit the Middle East at a kind of high point in many of the countries of social struggle, I think is quite significant. The fact that we did have these widespread street and popular mobilizations in Iraq and Lebanon, in Sudan, in Algeria, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in 2018 and 2019, and even into 2020, in the early months of 2020. I think this is significant because those mobilizations, I think, to a significant degree, were able to capture this kind of twinning of the political and economic that I spoke about, and that was perhaps not so present in the demands and the kinds of consciousness of the moment of 2011, that first wave of uprisings. I think the kind of thinking through the linkages between authoritarianism and economic reform, the need to challenge the inequalities in wealth, and also the regional inequalities, I think came through much more clearly in that second wave of uprisings. And I don't think that kind of impact or that kind of consciousness has been lost. It's certainly true that the pandemic has been used to kind of quash and demobilize a lot of the protests. But if we look at, for example, at Sudan, we look at Lebanon, we look at Tunisia, we do see that I think this kind of heightened consciousness, the potential for further protest and further mobilization is still there. But I do think that foregrounding this linkage between the kind of authoritarian state form and the need to kind of challenge and reverse the control of these disparities in wealth, the control and distribution of capital, linking this kind of authoritarian political form and the economic nature of capitalism in the region really is a key part of moving forward in the wake of the pandemic. So I'll leave it there and look forward to the discussion.
Okay, thanks, Adam. Not to toot my own horn too much, but since Shana is on the editorial committee of MERIP, Middle East Reports, I do remember I wrote a piece in MERIP about this inequality study that you cite from Thomas Piketty and his team. And one of the striking things about that report is not only that the Middle East is the most unequal, but the Middle East is taken as a regional unit, whereas the comparator countries in the report are single countries like Brazil, South Africa, et cetera. So one of the points that we made in that piece in MERIP was that it's precisely because of it's a region and state structures and citizenship borders and boundaries. It's through these borders through which this widening inequality has been produced. Not despite the region's structure, but partly because of it. Let's go to Amr Adly in Cairo. Amr.
So thanks a lot, Kevin, and well, thanks for the invite, like to appear on this panel. So I'll just like move directly, trying to pick the thread from what Professor Hanieh has just said, and I think the presentation does well, like fit very much into the discussion or the questions and hypotheses that he developed on the region. So the first thing here is I think we need to try to find a way in order to fit the Arab revolutions of 2011, and I would say also of 2019, into a global or universal history narrative, like how to relate these essentially national and regional processes to the transformations in the twin concerns of like contemporary liberalism, the ones about neoliberal capitalism and democracy. And I think that the previous presentation, as well as the raison d'etre of this panel, is exactly like the kind of conversation that we might have between the area studies. These were Arab revolutions at the end of the day that had national trajectories, but there are certain regional patterns, and at the same time they are related to an overall global dynamic that showed itself in the or still manifests itself in the like apparent crisis of democracy on the one hand, and not a very well functioning neoliberal globalized economy, especially since the meltdown of 2008, and then the pandemic, of course, has exacerbated many of the already felt structural problems. So the link between the national, the regional, and the global, I think, require some model which is explicitly multi-scalar, where we can fit many of the changes that happened on the national level, and that had their own like historicity, if we may use the term that was coined by Jean-Francois Bayard, and like having to do with how these national states evolved after decolonization as post-colonial states, how the processes of state making shaped many of the things, but also the position that these national economies occupied in the global division of labor since their independence in the 50s and 60s, and how this transformed. So this is a level that has produced its own logic. It has its own actors, its own dynamics, its own processes to an extent that, however, are independent yet are not separate from what has been happening or unfolding on the regional level or globally. So how we can, like an answer or as a tentative answer to the question of fitting the Arab revolutions into like a global history narrative in relation to world capitalism and democracy, we can think of what has happened in rather a simplistic way, like focusing on the outcome so far as a failed attempt at democratization in a context of global democratic backsliding and an overall crisis of liberal democracy in some of the most well-established or the best established democracies. That's one thing. So that's one element. The other thing is the regime transformation in various national cases related to terms of integration in the world's geopolitics as well as political economic orders. And I think that the presentation by Professor Hanieh has touched upon many of these points. So the idea here about the analytical coexistence of the three layers of processes, logics, actors, and flows, the national, the regional, and the global, can tell us about how this attempt at democratization that happened in, especially in 2011, when there were high hopes that eventually the Arab region would depart from its like exceptionalism to an extent, being the like region with the highest ratio of non-democratic regimes, etc., and how all of these, virtually all of these attempts like failed, especially if we take into consideration the recent developments in Tunisia, which was the most enduring case of an attempt at a democratized regime, a pluralist one, that has well so far fallen to very strong tendencies at concentrating power in a super presidential system following what seemed to be a constitutional coup. So the point here is that we need to think about democratization in relation to the what seems to be a global democratic backsliding. So I think that it's a bit ironic that there was this attempt on a regional scale following the Arab revolutions to establish a democratic order by unseating long-established elites, especially presidents, etc., and by raising like bigger questions about the state being more representative of the will of the people. Of course, we need to discuss how well, like the different framings of what happened in 2011, as Professor Hanieh was saying. It wasn't just like a case of the middle class youth taking to the streets in order to establish a democratic regime. Things where there were many other levels of contestation that were overlooked to a great extent by the mainstream Western academia, to the right, especially to the right, the ones that were thinking of these as like revolutions that were inherently friendly to earlier neoliberal reforms, or that they were corrective actions in the like the right like for the in order to like to rightly implement market-based reforms. We need, of course, to be very critical of this, but this was a level of contestation, definitely. The idea of trying to bring more representative orders following the uprisings of 2011, especially. So that might lead to the question of like universalism reaching its limits in that part of the world, especially with the failed attempts at democratization. So on the one hand, of course, we have we had what I saw as a neo-Orientalist discourse being produced for as well as against democratization in the immediate aftermath of the 2011 revolution, especially in cases where the revolutions were successful in unseating the regimes like against which the people revolted. So this neo-Orientalism for democratization was definitely well, like talking about certain features, certain characteristics that like would allow well, like religiously based parties, especially the Islamists, to take over as the successors of the nationalist or like the post-colonial state orders that were authoritarian and that could not deliver to the populations, etc. And this was neo-Orientalist to an extent, because there was this idea that democracy is likely to produce in that part of the world like an order that is conservative on many fronts, by the way. So it is democratic in the sense of, in the definitely the procedural sense, but it's not expected to be liberal. And at the same time, it was not expected also to challenge the well, like the basics of how state and economy should be related, the idea of market reforms, the idea of the reintroduction of the role of like IFIs, of international financial institutions, etc. At the same time, you had also the discourse that was neo-Orientalist, that was against democratization, the idea that this is a region that will remain exceptional because it is the one that is likely to bring up anti-democratic forces to power, either through democratic like means, mainly through elections, or through like later on military coups or takeovers or whatever. And again, you had this element of again, like the region being exceptional, and that discourse either for or against democratization that tried to use like already established conditions in the region as obstacles that could not be overcome, like tended eventually to reproduce an idea that there isn't much that could be done anyway, to what seems to be an inherent like tendency towards either the production of like a conservative, quote unquote, mainly Islamist dominated form of representation of the people that could be called democratic in a way or not, or one that would lead eventually to the breakdown of these, either into civil wars, into protracted cases of state failure, or into the coming back of the old elites one way or another, into military coups, the re-establishment of authoritarianism, etc. And at the same time, of course, with this question of universalism, you have the analytical tension between how we perceive the Arab region. And I think here that we went back into the old tension between where culture ends and where the political economy starts. Meaning that you already have like the debate about like the Arab state or the Arab states being in a region that is inserted into the global division of labor primarily through the production of fossil fuels, and that this creates mechanisms of intra-regional redistribution that like happens to be primarily and predominantly political. And I think that Professor Hanieh in his presentation talked about the investment part, but the flows of investment that can be dubbed private, and it's never that private anyway, looking at the state business relations in oil-rich countries, especially in the Gulf countries. But if we add to this credit, aid, both cash and in kind, and how these were shaped, or how these shaped many of the national trajectories, helping in bringing them into certain outcomes. To a certain extent, of course, they were not always that like successful. But that is also like a big question about the source of this kind of exceptionalism that creates these hurdles that cannot be overcome. So this is like one element about how if we can see this from the perspective of democratization that did not lead anywhere. However, we also have like the ability to, or we need to discuss the limits of many of these limitations. So one of the things here is that many of the discourse on democratization failing in the region, either the neo-Orientalist or the political economy of exceptionalism, if we may call it, doesn't have a very strong, doesn't put a strong accent on where the global, where the global is. So we have the national and the regional dimensions in this like multi-scalar analysis, but we don't always have a main streamed, well accounted for presence for the different global dynamics and actors, as well as processes, and how they were strongly present in the deciding on where this democratization, or where these democratization efforts that were post-revolutionary, where they ended, or how they ended up. So we definitely have the global capital markets that can tell us a lot, and this is an area that requires considerable attention. There's there's some academic work that was done on it, but not much that would speak to the the transitology or the democratization literature. It remains pretty much within the chambers of the political economists. But the 2008 crisis and its aftermath might tell us a lot actually about the attempt at democratization in the region in bad times. The idea that we in this part of the world, there was this attempt at pushing for democratization at a time when the like post-Cold War allure of democracy was actually in decline. So the overall context here can tell us a lot actually about the like the hegemony of democracy as like a universal ideal, and how it reached its limits in that part of the world in a way that can actually inform us about the attempt, like the claims of exceptionalism that, by the way, were not always imposed on the region. Many of them were consciously produced and reproduced within the region itself. So the discourse that we have nowadays in Egypt, that human rights actually are not that universal, the idea that they don't apply everywhere, and it's very hard to actually see that this is a discourse that is imposed on the region. It's rather the other way around. It's being strategically used. And I'm saying here that it is being consciously and strategically used because actually we are not dealing here with a case like Iran, for instance, where you have a regime that has an ideology that claims to be fighting Western imperialism culturally as well, and hence has its own concept of human rights. That's not the case at all. You have like a regime that has always had strong relations with the West, and that doesn't really have a very coherent, necessarily anti-Western ideology at all. Yet they have picked the thread from what seems to be an overall crisis in some of the best established democracies in the West, in order to justify the restoration or the resurgence or the resurrection of authoritarianism after the 2011 revolutions. So the political requirements also for accessing capital. I talked about the intra-regional dynamics of the redistribution of oil rent that proved to be quite important in the restoration of authoritarianism. In definitely a case like Egypt, for instance, the idea that immediately after 2011, Egypt became the battleground between the Qatar versus the UAE Saudi Arabia axis, which is quite interesting, of course, bearing in mind the relative weights in terms of population, for instance, that it tells us a lot about the unequal distribution of wealth on a regional basis, not only within the nations, but between nations themselves, and in a way that can also tell us a lot about how aid at a certain moment and soft loans that were given helped shape the outcome in a country like Egypt, but as well as in some other cases. But also it allowed, or it was related to the reinvention of the role of international financial institutions worldwide, taking the post the post 2011 cases of the Middle East as examples. So you had the IMF, the World Bank, etc., being quite delegitimized following the 2008 crisis. And the movement against austerity measures, the erosion of the legitimacy of neoliberalism as a development or as a market-based development ideology. And it's very interesting that the Middle East, with cases like Egypt, like Tunisia, like Jordan, like Morocco, served as some of the earliest cases worldwide of the reinvention of the IMF and the World Bank again, in the name of rehabilitating these economies financially, as well as economically, following the turbulence and the turmoil that happened in 2011, 2012, etc. And this is something that can tell us a lot about how accessing global capital markets through borrowing, but also through the the attempt at attracting foreign direct investment, has passed through the old-fashioned financial restructuring and restabilization of these economies, with especially the IMF playing a central role. So here it's quite interesting that the authoritarian like restitution or restoration was very much related to the access of capital on the global level, like especially with global markets, and the IFIs being like step one as being the gatekeepers to a great extent. This is very clear in the case of Egypt, and it is becoming clear in the case of Tunisia, by the way. So this is like extremely interesting. And by the way, we have even like smaller cases that were forgotten because the revolutions of 2011 were crushed there, like Bahrain, for instance. Bahrain is very much the case. It's the idea that you have the big GCC countries, like big in terms of finance, like standing as underwriters to the access to foreign or to the global capital markets again. And this is something that can, again, tell us about the new forms of vulnerabilities that were created due to like the overexposure to foreign borrowing that were exacerbated by the COVID-19 crisis, and that are nowadays with the post-COVID like looming recovery, like higher interest rates and higher inflation rates in the United States and on the dollar, are likely to hit many of these economies quite hard. So that's like one thing. Another point that I would like also to bring up is like with where the global has gone, whatever happened to imperialism. That's another element that is quite interesting here, that the Middle East has been, as many people might know, one of the regions of the world that does not like that remained subject to not only neo-colonial, but rather like classical colonial interventions. The idea, for instance, in 2003, that you have the US coming from like far away and invading a country like Iraq is a very 19th century style kind of colonialism that ceased to exist in most of the regions of the world, with of course exceptions. I wouldn't say exceptions, but like the Middle East is one of the most intensive cases, especially with the ongoing not the ongoing, like with the Israeli-Palestinian or the occupation of Palestine on the one hand, and the military intervention that has intensified in the that has been present in the Middle East in ways that are only, I think, comparable to certain cases of classical neo-colonialism, like Central America, as well as Central America and the Caribbean on the one hand, as well as some of the Sahel countries in Africa, where we have like a presence, like an active military presence by the ex-colonized, especially the French, that are being now displaced by the Russians. But one of the things here is that you have the case with imperialism definitely weighing heavily on these national outcomes, on the outcome of many of these national trajectories, and the very fact that the United States was interested in I don't know, like withdrawing and decreasing their presence in economizing on their involvement in the region, something that started a couple of years before the 2011 like the outbreak of the 2011 revolutions, definitely had its own impact in a way that ironically led to a very strange kind of discourse where you have the blame on the Americans for not intervening in some cases, which is like very strange. But it's something that tells you again about how the same dynamics get reproduced from the people within the region for after having been exposed to them for a very long time. But we definitely have as part of this transformation in the kind of the U.S. imperialist presence in the region, the rise of what seems to be regional imperialisms. And this has been quite defining. One cannot really ignore the axes that were formed, and where many of the nations that witnessed the revolutions in 2011 became the battlefields. Of course, you can think of the case of Iran in relation to Syria and Syria, Iraq also as of 2019, and like Lebanon after 2019, Yemen definitely, and of course the Saudi-led like alliance or whatever, and like as Professor Hanieh was saying, like the remaking of many of these arrangements with some of the GCC countries coming closer to Israel to counter Iran, the role of the Turks, but in Syria as well as in Libya. But like overall, you definitely have regional imperialisms that like meant to reproduce to a great extent the same or a closer imperialist pattern. And of course, we have the mini imperialisms by the like much smaller countries like the UAE, for instance. And this is like mini imperialism. I'm having problems really like thinking about Qatar or the UAE being like countries that try to fill in the vacuum. We can discuss this a bit. Like I call them company states. Regional, yeah. So all of these led to certain regional dynamics that could only be understood in relation to the broader global transformations in a way that eventually weighed on the defining of many of the national outcomes when it comes to democratization and the kind of political transformation that was like sought after, or that was promised in 2011. So I would like to conclude here by saying that it's like we ended up with a global or with global and regional contexts that were all reinforcing anti-democratic structures and actors. And hence the story was quite like predictable in a way that where it was like for all the odds rather than against the odds. It's not that it was inevitable. But the idea is that the changes that were happening on the global and the regional context, and they were both related, helped definitely in overpowering many of the pro-democratic actors and precluded the chances. I'm not saying here that these were structural hurdles that could not be overcome, but there was an element of contingency, especially that these were moments that were quite fluid. But the point is that these obstacles were like ones that made it definitely much harder and made it easier for the restoration of authoritarian orders later on, with the like Middle East like part of the story that needs to be told really is how the changes in the region were tied in a direct manner to the backsliding of democracy in Europe as well as in the United States. There is a story to tell, not only through the flows of refugees or the rise of Islamophobia, but there are more direct as well as indirect processes through which the periphery was tied to the overall democratic backsliding in the core itself, where like the failure of democratization could be related to the crisis of democracy in these parts or in these parts of the world, as well as like the situation overall. So it's like fluid, it's like bi-directional, and that's it. Okay, thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Amr. Let's go to Shana. Professor Marshall is going to agree to act thanks to her as a discussant, and to broaden out and connect some of the remarks made by Adam and Amr. And then as to those in the audience, also Bob and CK and I will probably chime in afterwards. So Shana, please.
Great, thank you. So thank you very much, Adam and Amr. I'm familiar with much of both of your work, so it's a real pleasure to be here today to talk to you and to ask you some questions and to sort of touch on some areas where you're your work overlaps. So the panel description had this question about issues pertaining to social class, business-state relations, but also about the region's insertion into the global economy and what that tells us about authoritarian retrenchment in the Middle East and North Africa. So I wanted to think about what those processes of insertion into the global economy actually looked like in concrete terms. So the Gulf, of course, the GCC states, the major oil exporters, became a huge spigot, essentially, for the production of surplus capital, right? That not only made those ruling families extraordinarily wealthy, but that also allowed for the financialization, or at least accelerated it and deepened it, the financialization of the entire global economy, right? If we think about the impact that it had on the creation maybe of Eurodollar markets, but certainly in the sense that it drove enormous growth in private equity and a lot of different sort of the production of new forms of debt collateralization. It also helped finance, the military-industrial complex in the U.S. and Europe, massive price increases in urban real estate in major cities around the world, in Europe and the U.S., and also in Asia. A lot of the funding went to Silicon Valley, also through private equity funds, and to a lot of the government relations and management consulting firms that are in DC, all around my university. On the other hand, you have the agricultural and textile producers in North Africa, who fill a different niche for the global economy, right? By supplying very cheap vegetables and fruits and textiles to consumers in Europe that cannot be produced in Europe, right? Because of labor regulations, minimum wages, and other sort of working conditions regulations, rules about the use of water resources and other environmental regulations that don't exist to the same extent in North Africa. And then, of course, just the weather, right? You can't grow a pomegranate in Germany, no matter how much you pay people. And so these low production costs also make those countries in North Africa extraordinarily profitable destinations for the investment of the same surplus capital that you have being generated in the Gulf states, as well as the capital that's floating around in the US and Europe, which is produced by this enormous degree of income inequality, right? You have all of this sort of footloose capital, or, surplus capital that's desperately looking for outlets where it can earn a return on its investment. And these are the sites often for the investment of that surplus capital. But to me, these the positions of these regional groupings seem very entrenched, because they grew out of the process through which these regions were integrated into the global economy, right? When they were integrated into the global economy, these were the conditions, and this is how they became sort of sites of production, or sites of surplus accumulation. And so those are very rigid, it seems to me, and also very beneficial for the core capitalist, the sites of core capitalism in the US and Europe, because they serve these different functions for the holders of capital in those areas. So I'd be super interested in hearing from Adam or Amr what you think about that, whether it is incredibly entrenched, whether there's some way to sort of loosen the way those, the role or the position that those entities have sort of in the global economy, and how we might move away from that situation.
Okay.
Are we
thank you.
okay? Yeah.
You can keep going. No, you have.
Well, I thought it would be better to do that, and then I have another extremely long, lengthy question. So.
Okay, so these particular positions and forms of regional and national actors in relation to core capitalist markets, asset bubbles, financial flows, and commodities. Adam and Amr, is this stuck in path dependence, or were there actually reorganizations of these relations in particular moments of time over the last maybe, not from the 1970s onwards?
So, should I go on?
Go ahead, Amr, go ahead.
Yeah, I actually think that there has been a redefinition of like the mode of insertion, not when it comes to international trade, because these are like things that are quite hard to change, like having to do with like many non-oil, non-natural gas sectors having trouble becoming like more competitive or getting integrated into global value chains, but especially the like easier like redefinition of the modes of insertion into global finances. Or global financial systems. I think that you have Egypt as a case in point. I'm not sure whether we can generalize beyond Egypt. You do know that all Egyptians are quite Egyptocentric, and they usually think that whatever applies to Egypt applies to the rest of the Arab world, which is true, but don't tell other people in Arab world. They get offended. Okay, so the case that I know about Egypt is that we have like this mode of insertion being like redefined radically, and so on the one hand you have less access and less access to foreign direct investment compared to the times of Mubarak, for instance, where the strategy was explicitly targeting higher access to foreign direct investment in oil and non-oil sectors, and being very reserved when it comes to external borrowing, especially after the Paris Club agreement in the early 1990s. This has been completely reversed. Now the mode of insertion is very much dependent on foreign borrowing, especially through the issuance of bonds in like on global financial markets, with FDIs for different reasons being at like at very low levels compared to the decade before the 2011 revolution. And this, by the way, was like there was a co-evolution between this mode of insertion and the kind of institutions and policies governing the economy. Definitely, the idea that you have like an overall economy that is less receptive to FDIs. This is very much true. And on the other side, you have like the regime dynamics that played into well, macroeconomic discipline, and hence like good credit rating in a way that would allow the rolling over of such foreign debt. So we have it's a dramatic case really of how this happened. I think that we have this happening on a smaller scale in Tunisia again. But I'm not, of course, sure like to what extent we can generalize beyond like these two cases.
Adam, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, if I could, thanks for that question, Shana. It's I think really actually goes to the heart of what we're talking about today. I think you've pointed out how important it is to understand the Middle East in relation to the development of the world market in relationship to development of global capitalism. I fully agree with that kind of beginning with that kind of question and echoing, I think, some of the comments that Amr made in his presentation as well. I wanted just to speak a little bit about the Gulf, because I think this is really key. It's clear, like I think Shana's absolutely right to point to the Gulf as being important, not simply for the physical commodity oil, obviously, that's very important, particularly in the post-Second World War period, when oil really becomes the central kind of form of circulating constant capital globally. But the financial side of oil's sale in the world market, I think, is really really important to foreground, whether it be through the kinds of the military the sale of military hardware that I know Shana has worked upon, whether it be through the formation of the euro markets. The debt crisis, of course, of the 1980s was deeply bound up with the way that the Gulf surpluses and then some of the more contemporary points that Shana spoke to about Gulf foreign direct investments elsewhere around the world, I think is really key. However, I think the point about all of this is that the global financial architecture, and in particular, the centrality of Anglo-American banks or the US within this was very closely connected to what happened to the Gulf and what happened in the Middle East. I think this is really, really key. So if we do accept that we're at this moment of perhaps a relative decline of US power, or certainly the emergence of other rival powers, great powers, however you want to describe them globally, then I think this has implications for the position of the Gulf and the wider Middle East in global capitalism. So I think it's still clear that the US is the major ally and the major kind of prop to power in the Gulf. However, I do think there's interesting changes taking place in relation to China's role in the Middle East. Again, this is not just a question of oil. I mean, the Gulf's oil now flows mostly eastward, not westward, which was kind of the historic pattern. But it's also true in relation to finance as well. There's increasing foreign direct investment from the Gulf into China in a range of sectors that are not necessarily related to the hydrocarbon economy. But it's also true in the opposite direction. China's investments in the Gulf and the wider Middle East. But I mean, for example, the Belt and Road Initiative, the headquarters of China's banks in relation to the BRI project is actually Dubai. In regional headquarters for Africa, South Asia, the Middle East is Dubai. So it's quite, I think, important to understand the way that the Middle East is placed within this kind of rivalry between China and the United States. I think, for example, that the war in Yemen can be partly understood in relation to these global rivalries. So while I think the US remains kind of the dominant power in relation to the Gulf, I do think that there's increasingly going to be tensions around this as we move forward. The one thing that I think is also important to foreground in this is in terms of the Gulf and the nature of the state in the Gulf is also the significance of the Gulf's class structure, not in terms of capital, but also in terms of labor, and the fact that the majority of the labor force in the Gulf is made up of temporary migrant workers that have no citizenship rights and no way of obtaining any kind of permanent residency or citizenship rights in the region. I think this is really important because often we describe and talk about the Gulf in relation to these big, oil, finance, petrodollars, etc. But actually, the class structure in the Gulf, the fact that the majority of the resident population there can basically be deported at any moment is really key to how these monarchies reproduce themselves. And it's different from somewhere like Iran or Iraq also, or Algeria, where you also have oil-rich states. So I do think this is particularly important to understand in terms of how the Gulf's particular place in US power is connected to its labor structure, not simply its fact that it's oil-rich.
Hey, Shana, do you want to proceed with the second big question?
Yes. I like, coming up with questions that are, an excellent opportunity for me to demonstrate how smart I am. So that's why they're so long. I'm sorry. So the second question that I have is about this, the real overemphasis that we've seen from scholars of the Middle East, or especially in political economy, and then also in mainstream sort of economics. But this focus on one side of the political economic equation, right? So this fact that, Egypt borrows too much money, these states are spending too much money. And to flip that, and I think that looking at finance is such an excellent way to do that, and really a great way that in both of your work is easy to pull out and to sort of help students understand what actually are the major factors going on here. So right in the mid to late 70s and early 80s, when we're talking about the third world debt crisis, right, it wasn't just that these countries needed to borrow funds during this massive global recession in order to finance social programs and increasingly expensive energy and food imports, but it was also this huge influx of petrodollars, right, that was flowing into US and European banks. And those banks were extremely eager for an outlet, somewhere to invest those funds, somewhere to lend those funds that would earn them a higher return than what they were getting in the traditional investments in manufacturing, right, in the core capitalist countries where those profit rates were slowing down. So that additional fact that these loans were very profitable and carried relatively little risk of default, because the IMF could just come in, of course, and make new loans, right, so that those previous lenders would get paid off by those new loans, meant that much of this loan activity was shaped and designed by the creditors as an effort to increase their own returns, right? Not as a way of lending money to help these post-colonial states develop their economies. So it's this sort of like push side of the equation, right? Rather than the pull side of the equation, which is what so many scholars focus on. And looking at privatization, the process that Amr, of course, and Adam both detail very expertly in their work, it wasn't just that states were trying to sell off assets, right, to earn money, but you also have the ruling class, right, which has accumulated this enormous amount of concentrated wealth because you have such high levels of income inequality, and they're looking for stuff to buy up, right? And even if those assets were systematically undervalued, they could still pump a lot of their surplus capital into purchasing these state assets, right? So I think, Adam, in the piece that you shared, you cite $40 billion in less than 20 years, right, that passed from the state sector in the MENA to the individuals who purchased these newly privatized assets, right? And this is, in a sense, this is equity capital, right? This is real capital. This was land, this was machinery, this was equipment, this was infrastructure, right? It's not NFTs, right? They were actually getting like something real for this. And that was the basis for production in the region. So what do you both think about that sort of flipping the lens to look at it from that side, from the pull side or the push side, right? Big capital pushing for these conditions in borrowing countries, where so much of the literature has actually taken the opposite approach, at least rhetorically.
Can I add on to that? I was, intrigued by Amr's point about the way in which the region has been exceptionalized both from the outside and the inside, right? And of course, how particular narrative stories about why the region is different, why particular countries, didn't democratize, those stories circulate. Scholars push back against them sometimes, kind of reaffirm them. So one of the stories which is very common is that, some concept like clientelism, nepotism, corruption, a narrowing of the political and economic elites, that this is a kind of process in which is common across the region, is recognized by the population, and one makes the region more susceptible to quote unquote populism, whatever, which is a nebulous term that I don't like to use. But two, that this is somehow an endemic exception to the region, which can explain the ways in which these states are able to retrench authoritarian forms of rule, and also it also explains economic underdevelopment, right? It's a very local and also tend to be exceptional accounts, but also these accounts are produced by often area studies scholars at least working on the region, not working on East and Southeast Asia, for example, in which if you read that literature, also these terms are wielded quite frequently. So on top of Shana's point about the kind of the bi-relational, right, forces, which are kind of locking in some of these processes. I'd like to get your comments on not pushing back, but maybe at least putting in context these common stories that we hear all the time about. It's really it's the either nature or characteristic of rule there, in which elites are closing and basically clientelism is reproducing authoritarian forms of rule.
Should I,
Adam, please.
Yeah, kick off. Yeah. Yeah, thanks again for both those great questions. I would, firstly, on Shana's point about the kind of where these pressures came from, I do agree that it's not, what Shana's highlighted, I think is really key. I think it's interesting to look again at the way post 2011, the Gulf states' involvement in places like Egypt, and in fact all the way through the region, has worked in close partnership with the international financial institutions, and often has been actually at the front line of this, because as Amr pointed out, there was strong popular opposition to the kind of embedding of the IMF and the World Bank in the region post 2011, and it was the Gulf that actually paved the way for these institutions to come back. They were the ones that guaranteed, firstly, that the kinds of policy strategies that followed in the wake of 2011 were amenable to the World Bank and the IMF, all the way. I mean, look at in Egypt through 2014, 2015, 2016, all of those negotiations that took place with the IIAS. The Gulf was playing a really key role in determining what those policies would be like, and ensuring that the governments would accept these loans from the IIAS. There was also, I think, a really interesting thing that happened immediately after 2011, which was the entry of the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development into the Middle East, which previously had not been present in the region. Obviously, EBRD had been set up in relation to Europe's transition. Eastern Europe's transition to capitalism, and the kind of language that was used by the EBRD at that moment, 2011, in relation to their entry into the Middle East, was again really much really along these lines of the political and the economic, free markets and free democracy, all of this kind of stuff, but again closely connected to the Gulf's connection to the post-uprising governments. So I do think it's really, Shana was talking more about, I think, the process in the 70s, but I think post 2011 we can see a push continuing, if you like, in that same direction. The other thing that I think, though, is really important to introduce when we're thinking about this is, it's not simply what happens in these in Egypt, Tunisia, Jordan, in terms of investments in those countries. I think it's also important the way that capitalist groups in these non-Gulf countries have increasingly seen the Gulf as a core center for their own accumulation. The fact that Egyptian capitalists, Palestinian this is particularly true, by the way, for diaspora capitalist groups such as Palestine and Lebanon, who have made their base in one or more of the GCC states and really used that base as a major center for their own accumulation, often more than what they do in their home countries. So in this sense, we kind of see this regional coming together of capitalist classes, again, linked to the dynamics of accumulation in the Gulf, very often real estate in the Gulf, construction firms and so forth. So the case of Palestine is a very clear example of this, where the major business groups in Palestine, I mean, they dominate the Palestinian economy in the West Bank, but actually their main activities are not in the West Bank. It's actually in one or more of the Gulf states, and some of them actually have citizenship in the Gulf, which is something very difficult to do. So yeah, that's how I'd respond to Shana's points. Just on the Kevin's point about the kind of exceptionalism, to my mind, I think one example of this, which is the one that kind of aggravates me the most, is kind of the rentier state approaches and the kind of attempting to explain development in the region, whether it be the Gulf or other oil-rich states, through just the presence of oil rents. I think this is if we're talking about kind of explaining patterns of social development through this kind of the presence of something specific to the region, like oil. I think it's the rentier, the RSC, or the rentier state theory is a big bugbear that I think needs to be challenged, both within and without the Middle East studies.
Amr, do you have any things to add? And then maybe Bob or CK have a question on the overall.
Let me react first to the first question raised by Shana, and I believe that there are always forms of resemblance having to do with the parts of the world that are suffering from some form of capital shortage, and they have to abide by the conditions and the rules by those who have the capital to extend to them, either in the form of investment aid or debt. However, these conditions have changed considerably since the 1970s, in my view, of course, having to do with the financialization of the global economy. And this translated into two things. Like on the one hand, there are lots of dollars that are that have been circulating around, to the extent that you have countries like Egypt or Argentina or Turkey or Colombia being or becoming favored destinations because they pay higher high interest rates, especially on their national currencies, provided that they can convert the money or come up with the foreign currency that they need in order to service that debt. And this has definitely translated into more fiscal room for many of these countries to not only to invest, but also to sustain social coalitions, either narrow or broad, it depends, having to do with this access to debt on the capital market. It also created an opportunity for them to have more room, relatively speaking, compared to the 1980s, in devising their own economic models, as long as the macroeconomic indicators that are needed for them to get the right kind of credit rating is met. And this is something that you find in a country like Egypt, for instance, where the restabilization and the remaking of the political regime after 2013 required like a model of state developmentalism somehow that well deviates clearly from the precepts of neoliberalism, from liberalism, from whatever the IMF or the World Bank would like to see. And yet it like the fact that they use the IMF in order to gain access to the global financial market definitely allowed them more room to decide on the structure of their economy. So the very fact that they are no longer dependent fully on IFIs, and that IFIs are mainly the gatekeepers, because their comments on these economies are the ones that eventually impact the interest rate, the conditions of borrowing, and their the exchange rates, etc. So this is a setting that created some new rules for the game. It allowed some room for the the domestic or the national elites ruling compared to the 1970s. But at the same time, it exposed them considerably to kinds of volatility, having to do with the fact that now most of the debt is being traded on market basis, and there is an element of volatility that is definitely not present when dealing with international financial institutions, with regional development banks, etc., and not even with the commercial banks as of the 1970s and 80s that do not lend governments anymore. They learned the lesson and they lend them through through private equities. So the fact that you have these private equities, I think, has set new dynamics in motion, starting from the Asian crisis in 1997 onwards. It's just like taking different forms in relation to the exchange rate systems, to the domestic banking systems. So the terms of integration are very different. It does not mean that the power dynamics have radically changed. Meaning that you still have the countries that have shortage in capital being definitely weaker than those who are offering capital. But this is very general, because beyond this, again, you have reinvention, reconfiguration of many of these relations, and I think that it's extremely important for us to take this into consideration, because it tells us a lot. As for the other question, I completely agree with the the story of neoliberalism in that part of the world where political elites weigh heavily on the accumulation of wealth and income, especially through the very the opacity of what is public in relation to what is private. And it seems that, again, the Middle East and North Africa are no exception, meaning that if one thinks of a case like China, for instance, China is a very interesting success story, unlike the region that we are talking about, yet where state business relations are so close, and where it's extremely hard to distinguish between the economic and the political elites. They are not that differentiated. And it's up, is it something that has to do with the periphery? It's something that has to do with the a certain stage of capitalist development. That's something that's very debatable, among academics. But the point here is that these forms of cronyism, state capture, corruption, or whatever, where private assets and private authority is used for the accumulation of the private accumulation, one way or another, of those who are in power, needs to be embedded or re-embedded into how these regimes work, especially the ones that have been undergoing attempts at restabilization and like restitution, usually on authoritarian terms. It's extremely important. It's something that is much bigger than the simple, direct utilitarian logic of self-enriching or self-indulging elites. There is a dynamic of power here. When it comes to distribution, like it's very important whether to maintain a narrow constituency of state actors, especially coercive institutions that can bring about like public order, or other redistributional attempts at the broader populace in the attempt at rebuilding legitimacy one way or another, including the like the attempted like invention or rediscovery of national mega projects as part of like economic nationalism. The very odd mixes by gestures of redistribution and what seems to be welfare provision again in the case of Egypt on the one hand, together with crushing the austerity on the other. I think that all of these really have to do with the immediate like with on this multi-scalar thing with the national with the national processes that are independent, that have their own independence, relative, of course, as usual, from the regional and the global. But there is room that was allowed by the financialization of the global economy for many of these contradictions between the national and the global.
Okay, we got CK Lee has a hand up.
Hi, I just want to thank all three of you, the three speakers. I've learned a lot. I know next to nothing about the Middle East, and your very clear presentations really is a great help. And therefore, I don't have really any profound question like Shana's to ask. As a student of China, I'm glad to hear both of you, the speakers, making sort of some comments on China. And I'd like to ask a little bit more. So one is more generally, how does China figure into this twinning of neoliberalism and authoritarianism, in a sense that does it make it more entrenched, reproducing this tightly knit kind of relationship between neoliberalism and authoritarianism? Or, as if I'm correct, I'm hearing that both of you are suggesting that it could be a game changer. That is, some of the rules of the game, both in terms I can think of loan negotiations, the terms of loans, as well as how the elite, these national or regional elite, relate to global finance. Can they play the game that having China as an alternative? Could they be more in a position to decide what to do or revert that kind of subordination that traditionally the World Bank and IMF has imposed on them? And for Egypt in particular, because I mean, people studying China, if you ask them about the Middle East, the primary Chinese interest would be the Suez Canal corridor, because it's not just economic, it's also military and everything that has to do with the Belt and Road. The sea route of the Belt and Road has to go through that part of the world. And I wonder if there has been good studies, not just to say, how much money has been invested, but more about who are the players. Is it state-owned enterprises or private capital? Because I have a student who studied that part and he was telling me that it's private. I'm very surprised if private companies are the drivers of Chinese presence in that very strategic part of Egypt. And so who are the players, the kind of dynamic, the relational dynamics between the Chinese as an alternative source of finance and loans and also potential geopolitical partners rivaling, competing with the US? And that if Africa is any reference, those African elite know how to play. I mean, not always to the interest of the countries, but they are no fools. They've been playing with all these colonialists all these years. So they know how to play when you have two masters, let's say. And I'm just wondering, just shed some more light onto the dynamics and not just the fact that China is there, with lots of money to throw around, but just who are the players? Are the games being changed between the Middle East and China, as opposed to the Middle East and the conventional, traditional colonial powers from the West? Thank you.
Okay, Luke would like to take on the third big question.
I could kick off with that if you like, Karen. Thanks, CK. So I think part of the difficulty in responding to that is that things are still very much in flux, I think, in terms of which direction where things are heading. I would say, as I said earlier, that this kind of, the US remains throughout the region the dominant capitalist power due to its place in the global system in terms of the kind of regional security architecture, the connections with the Gulf, with Israel, with the different military regimes. The US still is predominant. However, that is changing and has the potential to change. But I think China to date is still quite happy to see the US take that role to a large degree, certainly in terms of oil and the shipments of oil and the security of the Gulf region. I think it's quite happy to do that. But in terms of the different actors involved, there are, I think, private actors, capitalist actors involved from China in the Middle East in terms of kind of trading activities. So beyond the level of oil and state-to-state relations, there's significant trade in goods that takes place both from Arab business people who have these quite interesting kind of trade routes with China, including being based part of the year in China, basing their production of certain goods in China. For example, in Hebron, in the West Bank, there's strong connections between business people in Hebron and businesses in China, and like trading connections that are very well established, that are all private merchant connections that take place. Also in terms of kind of construction and urban development, you will see that Amr can speak, I think, to this perhaps much more authoritatively than I can, but certainly in the Egyptian context, the new Cairo capital city is being redeveloped through Chinese construction and development capital. So I think there's ways in which the kind of some of these like urban development models are being more and more tied to these investments from China as well. So, and I think this is important in relation to your question about authoritarianism, that things like urban surveillance, kind of authoritarian urban living I think will partly be shaped through these connections with China in places like Egypt. So I don't think it's necessarily a benign influence in the sense that it's opening up extra options. It could also reinforce, I think, the authoritarian tendencies that we've spoken about. Yeah, the one, I mean, I do think, again, I want to speak, I think perhaps this, you know, in terms of the Suez and stuff, but I do think it's interesting that China's only overseas military base is in Djibouti, you know, right at the entrance to the Suez. And I think the kind of, again, as I said in my initial presentation, I think the way that the war in Yemen is partly connected to China's presence or interest in kind of the Indian Ocean, the Suez Canal, the Horn of Africa, the Gulfs, and particularly Saudi Arabia and the UAE's attempts to have a place in the kind of reworking of trade routes and in that part of the world. The fact that you know, Neom city that Saudi Arabia is building is opposite, is on the, you know, is really kind of knitting together Egypt and Saudi Arabia, both sides of the literal coasts there. I think so that there's both a rivalry and some level of joint interest involved in how China is kind of relating to actors like or countries like Saudi Arabia and the UAE in that part of the world.
So,
Go ahead, Amr.
Kevin, should I jump in? Yes.
Go ahead.
So I think that this question, like, I'm afraid that I have like more questions than answers when it comes to the current as well as the future kind of involvement of China economically as well as geopolitically in the region, as well as in or as well as in Egypt. But we don't know much, by the way. The Suez Canal zone. There appear to be like some very ambitious plans at the beginning. And little has materialized, which is interesting because it seems to be a rather like common pattern where like the Chinese were expected to get involved in the Suez Canal, in the capital city, and they ended up doing stuff on a much smaller scale than what was perceived. And it's interesting here to see why this happened. I tend to believe it has to do with the context and the sequencing that the like political stabilization followed in Egypt. So following 2013, when relations were quite bumpy with the US and the EU, because of like like what happened in terms of stabilization, etc. China, as well as Russia, by the way, appeared both on the table, and like there seem to have been plans. I'm not sure whether this was done strategically in order to induce the traditional masters in the West to act in a certain way and to get concessions from them, or this was done because they had no other option. But it seems that the invoking of a bigger role for the Chinese is not looking for more options. It's rather when they run out of options. And like the greatest proof, in my view, in the case of Egypt, is that the moment the IMF deal was signed in 2016, the moment they had access to like the global financial markets, plus the IMF, etc., many of these plans with the Chinese and with the Russians, especially in the case of the nuclear power plant, many of these plans were either completely deserted or were like witnessed some scaling down. And this gives me the impression, again, it's an impression, it's not based on any information, it's just that I'm reading the pattern and trying to discern some some conclusion from this observation, is that there are so many uncertainties when it comes to dealing with China. In terms of investment, in terms of the very nature of how business and the state are intertwined in China when it comes to FDIs. The idea that you and of course, like this is like what I read, like my knowledge of China's involvement in the world is dependent mainly on secondary literature. So feel free to correct me if I'm saying something wrong. But the idea that you have these state-owned enterprises that operate in infrastructure that are usually supported by some state-owned bank or by the sovereign fund or whatever. They come in. So you have, like, it's not only that you are dealing with a private equity fund or with a commercial bank or whatever, you are dealing with the Chinese government one way or another, adding to it the complexities in an already, like, of geopolitics in an already very complicated region. So I think that the moment they have like the more traditional options of borrowing on the market or dealing with the IMF, like like to an extent the devil that they know, they go in that way. When they don't have access to these, they start to venture through this. But at the same time, I think that they are definitely aware of the not very happy cases in Sri Lanka, in Kenya, in Zambia, where again the very political nature of what seems to be investment or borrowing translated into like not only the takeover of assets, but the takeover of assets with main consequences for the geopolitics of the region, something that I doubt Egypt can really afford, and like especially when it comes to the Suez Canal. So like this is my impression. But definitely the what seems to be like a slight version of the Cold War can be welcomed because it can be welcomed because they can always play them one against the other. But how this can be done is not very clear yet, because apparently, and again, correct me if I'm wrong, the Chinese don't have a very clear idea about what they are going to do here in the Middle East. This is one of the reasons why it's like uncertainty is very important in the decisions that they make.
All right, Bob, are you? We have about 10 minutes left. Bob, do you have any questions, or we can also, if anybody has any questions from the audience, they can send a question in the chat to Rohan or myself. But Bob, currently you're muted. You're trying to talk. I can't see you. Bob, you gotta unmute that. Unmute the Zoom.
Can you hear me?
Oh, great, yeah.
Okay. Just so I'm not completely parasitic here. I guess a question I could ask would be, is kind of the relationship between sort of the whole and the parts, which I just specify to say, if you look at the patterns of world growth, global growth, and the regional and most of the regional or national growth, it's pretty much declining dynamism in a very in a not small way, but a pretty sharp way. If you're looking at things like GDP or GDP per capita or investment, that you have kind of since the 70s, decade by decade slowdown in all of this, with this might be a place to just to focus in, since we have so little time, the period from 2000, the crisis of 2008-9, et cetera, to the present, is really a period, it seems to me, of universal fall off in growth, even in East Asia, even in China, or if you want to look at it globally. So I wondered if how the speakers would say we should talk about that slowdown, of the whole, in relationship to the analysis of, say, the subject of this discussion, which, Middle East region or any other region, including East Asia, which would be the obvious one. So I hope that's a clear question. I hope it's not a stupid question.
No, it's great. I mean, it's the phrase that I'm going to use, democratization in hard times, is quite apt. Quite apt. So I'm going to Adam or Shana, actually, do you have anything that to close out on this?
I could make a quick response to say I think it's certainly true that the this long downturn, if you like, was a big element to the uprisings that took place in 2011. I think the way that the 2008 crisis was transmitted to the region, partly through the kind of opening up that had taken place. Things such as declining levels of trade, foreign investment, worker remittance levels that dropped to the region in 2008, 2009, were all major aspects to why 2011 took place in the first place, why the uprisings took place in 2011. And I think since then, the fact that we still are in this kind of long downturn, it has a big impact on the way that this kind of the authoritarian retrenchment that we've been speaking about, the fact that states have become more authoritarian, partly as a way of attempting to manage the crises that are a result of being part of this kind of world market. I think it's very clear. The one thing, though, that I would say about this, and kind of echoing some of the points I made earlier, is that it's very important to look at the differences across the region in this regard, and the fact that while there may be somewhat of a story of universal decline, there are also major differences between states in the region. And I think coming out of the pandemic, these differences are going to be accentuated. The fact that, GDP dropped 25%, I think it was in the case of Lebanon. In the case of the Gulf, it was 4%. And the expectations are that GDP growth will resume in the next few years. Similarly, in the case of Israel. So, the kind of gaps and the hierarchies within the region are going to deepen within this larger story of the long downturn. So that kind of variegation of the region, I think, is important to think about.
Okay. Any final comments by anyone?
I can say something super quick. I think we've really seen sort of the hyper exploitation of people at the very sort of bottom levels of the working class. So an example would be these mobile lending apps that target illiterate laborers, migrant laborers in the Gulf, right? To get them to borrow very small amounts of money. And then the interest that they pay, while to them is exorbitant, is also a very small amount of money. But this is another case where it's volume or mass is what is most important to capital, because there's, millions of these migrant workers, poor migrant workers in the Gulf. And they're all using these apps to try to maybe even their employers trying to use the app to siphon, even a very small, tiny amount out of their paycheck. So these apps are being used by millions of people, and these the owners of these technologies are able to amass, substantial amounts of money by taking just a tiny chunk out of the earnings or the wages of literally millions of workers. So I think that long downturn is also sort of pushing the sort of center of exploitation further and further sort of down the chain of the working class, until you have the sort of the focus of that exploitation on literally the most vulnerable and marginalized members of the population.
All right, well, I think this is a good time to stop. And actually, some of the points that came out today, I think we should pursue, we meaning Professor Brenner, Professor Lee, and myself, and of course, Rohan, our excellent student organizer for the Center for Social Theory and Comparative History, on the kind of dynamics of inequality that are going to be coming out of whatever is the post-pandemic world order, and both its repetition and retrenchment of previous processes, but also widening gaps between states and actors in these regional contexts. So we have 3 more panels coming up over the winter quarter at UCLA, and all information will be available at the center website, which will be posted along with this video when it goes live. So I want to thank everybody for participating. It was a great start to the quarter, and esteemed speakers, and thanks to Rohan specifically for helping us administer a relatively early session in the day as far as the center goes for Los Angeles time, but where everyone else is, they might be very different time. So thanks to all of you, and it was a pleasure moderating the panel. Thanks.